Welcome, everyone, to HOK Up Next. I'm Stephanie Miller, Director of Public Relations at HOK, and today I'll be leading a discussion on what happened at the recently concluded COP30 and what it means for the building sector and the built environment as a whole. Joining me are three leaders in sustainable design who all attended last month's UN Climate Conference in Brazil. First is Lori Ferriss. She's an architect, structural engineer, and preservation specialist who champions building reuse as a climate action in her role as co-founder of Built Buildings Lab. Lori attended COP30 as a delegate for Architecture 2030, the sustainable design nonprofit for which she serves as a senior fellow. Joining us also is Liz Beardsley, a senior policy counsel for the U.S. Green Building Council. Liz provides green building law guidance across federal, state, and regional jurisdictions, focusing on connecting building policy to climate mitigation. And then also Anica Landreneau, who is my colleague here and Director of Sustainable Design at HOK and a recognized leader in high-performance building design. Anica was one of the authors of the new LEED V5 Green Building Certification Program and also was in residence at COP in Brazil. So we're hoping that all of you are going to join in and communicate and participate by sharing questions and comments in the comments area below. We've got a lot to unpack, but as we can, we are going to address your questions in the chat. If we don't get to them, we also will try and follow up and have our experts respond afterwards. So let's dive in. We've got a lot to talk about. Before we dive into the implications of COP for the built environment specifically, I'd like to start with your general thoughts on what this COP did or didn't accomplish. And maybe, Anica, we'll start with you.
Sure. Thank you for having us. I think this COP was very interesting. This was the 10-year anniversary of the Paris Agreement, and so this was also a deadline for updates on nationally determined contributions, or NDCs. What's helpful to know is at this COP, we do see a confirmation of the Paris Agreement. We're not on track for the 1.5 degrees Celsius temperature change, but there is a confirmation or reconfirmation, recommitment to do what it takes to accelerate decarbonization and still try to stay very close to that 1.5 degrees and certainly under the 2 degrees. But it's helpful to understand where we are and that countries are still very much interested in maintaining the Paris Agreement. We did get 120 updated NDCs. I think we're still waiting on some additional updates from other countries. What we didn't see, COP Dubai, COP28, there had been a call for a roadmap to phase down fossil fuel consumption and a call for that to happen by this year. We did not get a binding agreement or non-binding agreement for that matter. We did not get language related to fossil fuel phase down at this COP. However, 86 countries did pledge to go forward, and in the spring of 2026, we'll be convening in Colombia to further discuss this matter and work on developing out that roadmap.
Liz or Lori, do you want to jump in with your more general observations?
Well, I guess I'll jump in and say that one thing that was really exciting about the COP this year was the introduction of the action agenda. So Anica did an amazing job of overlaying some of the more formal negotiations that happen in the formal structures of the UNFCCC for the party negotiators and for the state actors, including those nationally determined contributions. But as we know, that there's really a push for this whole of society response to the climate crisis. And increasingly in the COP process, there have been mechanisms to bring in what we call voluntary actors, which are those of us in practice, NGOs, industry leaders, as well as local governments, other levels of governance, basically everyone else working on implementation and action outside of those binding agreements. And so this year, the action agenda was created by the presidency to basically organize, curate, and focus and accelerate solutions through voluntary action. And what that meant was that, and I'll talk about this a little bit later, it created a place for buildings, but it created basically space for all of the different solutions that are continuing to drive measurable impact, no matter what happens in terms of the formal commitments. And it also created a tracking mechanisms that we can not only organize, coordinate the solutions that exist, but we can track their impact and their progress through global coalitions over the next several years. So that was one of my most optimistic takeaways from this COP.
And who is going to own that moving forward?
And
Will
I'll
it be
jump in
something
and
that now will get formalized in the agenda?
Oh yeah, so this is owned by the climate champion, the high level climate champions team, which does go from COP to COP. So there's commitment already from the future COP presidencies to continue this action agenda moving forward as a project of the climate champions team.
That's really exciting. And any other thoughts or observations about overall impact?
Liz.
yeah, I can jump in here. So yeah, just building on what Anica and Lori have said. First of all, the country's nationally minimum contributions did come in determined confidence, and they are, by all accounts, getting better in terms of more ambition and higher quality. And that really matters because, it's one thing to like set a target, but if a country starts to figure out how are we going to meet that, how are we going to, address our buildings, et cetera, then that provides more that the whole community can get around and try to support and engage on. So that was really welcome. I think in the text itself, there also was a lot more on non-party stakeholders, so more expressly recognized in the text the importance of the private sector, of business, of the NGOs and civil society, and also of the so-called subnational governments. And for those not in the in the parlance of the COP, that's basically state, local type governments. So they, as all of us know here, are really important for development and buildings and are kind of on the front line of resilience as well and climate impacts. So the fact that they're getting more visibility and more recognition as to their role, I think is quite important. And the last quick thing is finance. There were several reports that came out around COP around finance. There's a lot of pressure on finance to do more, especially on adaptation. So I think that will continue to develop. And that also, there are a few things in the text of the final cover decision, as it's called, that call on finance and call for a high level ministerial to work on finance. And really, there have been goals for quite a while. They get changed and so on, but really to try to work on the implementation side and to start to recognize private finance as part of the solution. So I think all these things are positive developments, even if there's not a straight line to 1.5 as yet.
Well, you've all at some point in your remarks commented already on where we are going to go now, what our world is, arguably about specifically buildings and the built environment. So what did COP30 meaningfully advance for the built environment? And is it a focus on energy use, decarbonization, resilience, adaptation, all of these? Maybe, Anica, we start with you again.
Yeah, I'll start with just mentioning, we talked about the role of subnational governments or states, localities. We had 14,000 commitments from those subnational governments, which does show how really engaged, cities, states, counties, other governments outside of the national level are in their climate commitments. And we got a report out from C40 that 100 of the largest cities in the world reported that they're reducing carbon emissions at a rate 5 times faster than the global average. What I think is really fascinating about that is these cities, these large cities, we know emissions tend to come at a rate of 50 to 75% from buildings. And we've seen that play out in a lot of the adopted building performance standards, certainly the benchmarking policies and other policies related to buildings. And what that says to me is that these policies are working, whether it's disclosure, transparency, benchmarking, or it's the actual setting of emissions reduction targets for those buildings at an energy use intensity or carbon intensity or other performance metric, that they're working, that we have enormous potential in those 100 largest cities with existing building stock to continue to rapidly accelerate the reduction in emissions through building retrofits and adaptation. Adaptation for resilience, but also for decarbonization. So I thought that was really, really a great outcome to see. This was dubbed the implementation COP. I think it's a pivot point in COP where we've seen a lot of building up to what are the solutions, and now we have the solutions. There's actually the Global ABC published a solutions guidebook that says we have the technology, we have the strategies to do what we need. It needs scaling up of implementation, and we need finance, but we know what it takes to reach these targets that we've set for ourselves. The other, I think, really interesting move for buildings was the adoption of a framework for responsible timber construction. Since Paris, there's been a recognition that nature-based solutions are a significant 2/3 portion of the Paris Agreement. And there's been discussions for the last few years around how we can build better with timber, both because it's a decarbonized building material, but also because it promotes the use of land use for forestry, for responsible and sustainable forestry. And so this coalition between forests and the building sector to really scale up the use of timber in construction and creating that framework for responsible timber construction, I think is really, really meaningful.
And I know, Lori, in particular, you had interest in reuse of buildings and heritage buildings.
Yes. Yes, this was a really interesting COP, an exciting COP for cultural heritage. For the first time, culture and heritage were really brought formally into the COP processes, both through the Global Goal on Adaptation, which was one of the major texts adopted at this year's COP, and through the action agenda. So I think what's really exciting to me about existing in historic buildings is that they're able to bridge both technical and cultural solutions to the climate crisis. And we're really focused a lot on technical solutions. Anica, you just mentioned I know we've been highlighting and promoting all of these technical solutions, and yet we're really failing to meet our targets. And part of that is because we're not harnessing the power of storytelling, the power of placemaking, the power of helping people imagine what the future could be that exists within the built environment, and particularly within the existing built environment. So I was actually there representing the Decarbonizing the Built Environment Through Heritage initiative, which is an invited initiative of the action agenda through the key objective on cultural heritage protection and climate action. But what's really interesting is that existing in heritage buildings help bridge between the building sector and the culture sector. And so I think this is another big opportunity for buildings coming out of this year's COP, is that it gives us this kind of transversal cultural doorway into a lot of the climate solutions and the financing and policy mechanisms that are being discussed, not just as a technical infrastructure solution, but also through this cultural lens of being the places where people live, work, play, form community, form connection, and change their behaviors, which is what we really need to see. So that was the big takeaway, I think, for cultural and heritage. And I do just want to respond to the good news from the building sector is that we also heard some bad news, that the Global ABC gave a preview of the next annual status report on buildings and construction. And they found that despite all this amazing work everyone is doing, our sector overall has increased emissions by 6.5%, or the rate of annual emissions over the past decade. So we know that, as Anica, as you say, leading cities, leading countries are doing amazing work and demonstrating how we can do this, but it's not happening equally and it's not happening quickly enough. So I think it's both. That was a real call to action, I think, is to really implement, as you say, start to implement and support the implementation more comprehensively in communities around the world.
Yeah, and I'll jump in there, Laurie. I appreciate that, because there's a couple of things that had some progress at COP that really go to this point of how do we really bend the needle, like in actual emissions. We know we can do so much better, and as Anica said, like we've had solutions for years. We continue to innovate, but we've just got to make that the norm. And so the Buildings Breakthrough is one such initiative. It was launched 2 years ago as part of the UNFCCC Breakthrough Agenda. And it's focused on national governments who have committed to the vision that near zero emission and resilient buildings are the new normal by 2030. And that's quite aspirational, but we know it's technically possible. So it's about aligning finance, definitions, really enabling policy and all the levers to point in the same direction and encourage that kind of bold progress. So at this year's COP, there was a event with the Buildings Breakthrough where each of the leads for their priority action areas presented their progress. We sit on the steering committee for the standards and certifications area, and we had, with that action, issued an interim report on a common definition for near zero and resilient building that is really aimed at informing national governments, primarily, and of course.
Okay, it sounds like Liz's audio may have glitched a little bit. I do want to pick up, she did mention the common definition for near zero buildings, the breakthrough agenda, the buildings breakthrough agenda, the global ABC, the UN environment program.
Start to get that out.
There you go, Liz. Sorry, you're back. We just lost you for a second.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
No worries.
We just got, I don't know if you had a concluding statement. We just got through the definition, the common definition of near zero buildings. If you had anything after that to add.
Thanks for that. I'm not sure what happened. Yeah, just mentioning another area was capacity building. So in that action area, our group is working on a new portal to try to get more of the technical information out and available around the world. So stay tuned. That will launch sometime in the early part of next year.
And I think we'd be remiss if we didn't note that this was the first time there was a ministerial meeting of the Intergovernmental Council on Buildings and Climate. I think it's been 20 years or so that I've been hopping up and down saying, why aren't buildings part of negotiations? We talk about decarbonization of industry, of agriculture, of all these things, at transportation, but often the demand side is what's driving the power sector, is driving the industry that's making our concrete or steel. And so finally, we have this ministerial level council on specifically on buildings and climate. I think this is coming on the backs of the Buildings and Climate Global Forum we had last year in Paris. We expect another one next year in Lausanne. And so there's finally a very concentrated focus area on buildings, and it's leveled up to the level of ministerial negotiation, which is really important. Buildings are taking center stage. I happen to think that that's because we've seen how much potential we have in the building sector to change through the demand side, both in the power sector and fuel transition, as well as in the different materials that we specify for our buildings. Speaking of that, the concrete and cement industry did issue a report as well, saying they feel like they're ready to take on deeper decarbonization efforts based on where they are now and what's available to them, that they can move forward and decarbonize more deeply. So I think that shows a reflection of the demand of the influence we have as an industry, but it also shows again that we are moving from a how and what are the solutions into more of a scaling up of implementation and finance era when it comes to climate action.
Anica, can I just jump in and say that because I was able to attend the ministerial meeting, which was very exciting. One outcome of that meeting, I suppose, was the adoption of the Belém call for action for sustainable and affordable housing. Yes. And what was very exciting to me about that is that this is, again, we're starting to understand the power of buildings, not just as individual climate solutions, but as complementary solutions and as enabling solutions to other societal challenges as well. So I think it's through this kind of alignment, understanding that housing and climate have to go together, that we're able to really multi-solve and unlock that power of building as solutions. So that was a big advancement.
Well, and it feels like going back to your point, Lori, about the power of storytelling and connecting all of these pieces that we know are not disparate, but people kind of want to put the built environment off separately and put transportation and agriculture and finding a way to help people in a really personal way understand what maybe feels so daunting. Is that something that you see the people who organize COP and participate getting better at, this concept of storytelling?
Well, I think it's being recognized because there's actually, going back to the action agenda, again, it houses so many of these solutions. There's several of the formal initiatives invited are about storytelling and the power of storytelling to catalyze change. And there are actually a plan to accelerate solutions, a kind of formal tracking mechanism within the action agenda focused on storytelling. So I do think that is there's a recognition of the importance of storytelling and changing hearts and minds if we're really going to tackle this. How well we connect that to the building industry, I think, is kind of up to us to really grab hold of that and harness storytelling.
Makes me wonder if.
Yeah.
Sure, go ahead.
Yeah, just one other piece there, in terms of connecting the dots, and that's that at the Buildings and Cooling Pavilion, it's always had a deep focus on decarbonization first and energy. More recently, there's been a lot more on resilience, which is critically important. But this year we did a session on health, and we really felt it was important to connect the dots there because that's a whole nother area of impact and co-benefit of doing decarbonization and dealing with resilience is providing health benefits. So we had participated at Climate Week at the launch of the Global Pledge on Healthy Indoor Air, which is an initiative not specifically connected to the buildings industry. It came more out of academics in the public health sector. So we and there's a connection with Australia and the US where there were two academic institutions that helped get that started. So we participate in an event on that at the Australia Pavilion, but then also wanted to really bring it to the building sector through that pavilion. So I think that is we've already heard back from people. They're really excited to do more in this area. And I think, the more we can arm people with, the talking points, the proof points, that they can then take to their projects and really meet people in terms of what their values are and their priorities. All these things are connected. So.
Well, and that ties to a question that has been posted that maybe is a little more housekeeping, but they want to know where they, as a private citizen, can find more information on the climate action items stemming from COP, particularly from NGOs. Is there one website that comes to mind, or do we want to drop something in the chat later for people as a resource? Anica, you're nodding.
Yeah, I think there's been a lot of what I would say is there's been a lot of posts, and you can certainly search on LinkedIn with the hashtag COP30. Global ABC's done a lot of posts that summarize some of these things that you can tag onto. Many of the other organizations that we represent here, Architecture 2030, USGBC, HOK, we also have posts that will have some of these links. I don't know if there's a single clearinghouse, unfortunately, that has links to everything. There's so much going on. You can always go back to the UN Framework on Climate Change, the UN's website, as well as the Buildings and Climate area of the UN Environment Program. But I don't know if I would say there's a single clearinghouse for all resources related to this. But you'll see a lot of things hashtagged COP30 that will have helpful links to some of this information.
And the Buildings Pavilion records there. So a lot of those sessions, people, it's worth, taking a few minutes and just kind of scrolling through. They're organized by day, but just kind of get a sense of the kind of topics that are being discussed, and then, watch one or two, because then it, helps you connect and kind of understand the conversation.
Yeah. And if you go to the COP website, I think they do have a list of the pavilions, and you may find resilient cities. Other pavilions also have recorded sessions. So you can kind of, by the theme that you have the most interest in, you should be able to go through and find several of the resources and the sessions that were recorded.
Yeah, and the UNFCCC did post coming out of the action agenda they compiled all of the indicators that have been developed, all of the plans to accelerate solutions that were accepted, and all of the announcements that were made by the, I think, more than 500 collective climate initiatives that were invited into the action agenda. So that's a great place to go that's sortable and filterable, where you can see both what's happening directly within buildings, but also what's happening building sector adjacent. And you can see who because these are all collective coalitions, who is participating. And many of these, because they're voluntary actions, civil society is engaged, and there are opportunities to get involved and tie your work into this agenda.
Great. And I see you've shared that. We'll drop that link in our comments as we go through this, but this feels like a natural segue into the next group of questions. As we know, the U.S. federal government did not send representatives to this COP. For the whole group, what impact did that absence have on the dialogue and especially on outcomes?
I can start here. I do think while the U.S. federal government didn't send its typical negotiators from the State Department, and certainly that is quite an absence, their leadership is missed. We did see several states, their senators, the representatives were present there. California was very vocal about participation at COP, and as the fourth largest economy in the world, their policy influences not just the other states in the U.S., but has a great level of influence globally. The policies that they set impact imports and exports, as well as the built environment disclosures. Many multinational companies in the billions of dollars of revenue range have a foot in California and are subject to their legislation around carbon disclosures and resilience risk exposure disclosures. And so California's participation was meaningful. Going back to storytelling for just a moment, I remember when California, who often is a policy laboratory for the rest of the US on a state by state level, when they passed AB 32, one of the ways they were able to do that is they had billboards talking about asthma and talking about, not emissions and climate change, but emissions and how many days your child may be in the ER due to asthma or other respiratory distress issues. And they were able to to connect that back to human health impacts. And I think that resonates on a very personal level in ways that sort of the global picture on climate and carbon emissions doesn't always resonate with the individuals at home making household decisions. So I think the participation by these subnational governments was very important. I would say some other countries have probably in the past used the U.S. as cover in negotiations, knowing the U.S. would have a very strong opinion on certain things. And so without the U.S. there, this may have been an opportunity for those nations to step up and negotiate a little bit more on their own terms. And so there may be some positive impact or outcome to the U.S.'s absence this year. While we hope that we're not absent every year, certainly it didn't deter the nations that participated, the 194 nations that participated from fully, I think, exploring all of their opportunities on both climate mitigation, but also resilience and adaptation.
Yeah, and besides California, there were officials local officials from across the country that were with the group, Elected Officials Protecting America, which is a great group of folks. And then also from Tennessee and New Mexico and possibly some other states. The Climate Registry really stepped up and they kind of relabeled their pavilion, I think the USA Climate Pavilion, and hosted quite a few events. And then Senator Sheldon Whitehouse from Rhode Island, he was the sole federal official at COP in an official capacity. And I mean, he was like running from event to event and trying to just have the most impact he could for the period that he was there. And it's a shame because there was a whole delegation, a bipartisan delegation of Congresspersons planning to go, but with the timing of the shutdown and the appropriations vote, they had to stay for that vote. So that is what happened there, because there would have been, I think, over 30 members of Congress at COP. And then the private sector too so there were quite a few events focused on elevating the visibility and the solutions that the U.S. private sector is bringing and implementing. And we did a session, and happy to have Anica in that, really focusing on like what the innovations are and what people are doing right now and kind of where that's heading to help further decarbonize and get us on track. So.
Yeah, and I did hear from some of the party officials that it did kind of dampen the tone of the negotiations not to have the U.S. there, particularly I think for the more vulnerable nations, some of the Pacific Island countries, for whom climate action is an immediate and existential threat. I think missing the U.S. and the potential for change, the potential for funding, for policy leadership that can come from the U.S. was, did impact, I think, the tone of the negotiations. But I agree with everything that Liz and Anica said, that there was a very strong showing of industry, of civil society, of local government leadership that did, brought the message from the U.S., brought the solutions, and I think did reassure everyone that we're still moving forward despite what may be happening at the federal policy level here.
Well, looking ahead, I know it's hard when you just all got back from what was probably an epic travel journey just to get to this COP. But what outcomes do you want to see in the near term as perhaps a result of this or stemming from this COP? And looking ahead, what should be on the agenda for COP31?
Well, I'll say that there's a lot that happens between COP to COP, and for buildings in particular, I would keep an eye on the event in Colombia that should be hosted in April around the energy transition and fossil fuel phase down. I think that's meaningful. We didn't talk about the utilities. There's a coalition of utilities globally that have committed 150 billion to electrification, to generation and storage. But that impacts our buildings, certainly what we're designing and how we're designing around the world. As well as resilience for those existing communities and cities and the built environment within that. So looking towards that, I think is important. The next Buildings and Climate Global Forum in Lausanne, I think will be a lot of active discussion around the built environment. And then Climate Week in New York is almost a mini COP. So I think we'll see quite a bit happening at those two events, the Buildings and Climate Global Forum in Lausanne and Climate Week in September in New York. Around where we're headed next. Saint-Gobain also hosted a coalition of many of our industry leaders around their construction talks this Climate Week and again here at COP, trying to tackle some of the priority action items like the shared definition of near zero buildings, but also some of the things that we've discussed here. There needs to be a very specific and targeted approach for buildings in emerging economies that's going to look different than it does for more established cities and communities, whether we have to build new construction versus whether we're adapting our existing buildings. And so we need to be very targeted and focused on how we define action items for those different types of built environment. Also, to that impact of storytelling that we noted, how do we move this from a compliance issue to a desire? Sustainable construction is a desirable outcome, and making the financial case that these buildings are profitable and have potentially better outcomes financially than not sustainable buildings is one of those as well. So seeing all of our different colleagues in leadership around organizations, both private and for-profit and not-for-profit, come together and try to tackle some of these priorities and work through them. I think we'd like to see some progress on that over the next year. So hopefully some of that is making its way into language by the time we get to COP31.
Liz or Lori?
Well, the other thing that's going to happen between now and COP31 are the SB, the subsidiary bodies meeting, which is the intermediate negotiation meeting, essentially, of the parties that happens in June in Bonn every year. Mm-hmm. And I think two areas, I guess I'm just going to reference back to Liz's point earlier about continuing to connect the dots and elevate these co-benefits, because two of the major pathways for negotiation are through the mitigation work program and the global goal on adaptation, as we talk about addressing mitigation and adaptation. And I think the building sector really fell short in making our voice heard in both of those negotiations this year, to be frank. The mitigation work program this year was focused on waste and circular economy, and there's no mention of buildings, despite the fact that buildings produce about 40% of global waste. So we missed an opportunity there. And in the global goal on adaptation that issued over 50 indicators to measure our progress on adaptation, there are 9 indicators for water, 8 indicators for human health, and 2 for infrastructure and human settlement. So I think we have a lot of work to do to help people understand why buildings are important for all of these other goals as well. And then just one other hope I have is that there's been an increasing acknowledgement of the importance of local and indigenous and traditional knowledge in advancing climate solutions, particularly in a contextually and culturally appropriate way around the world. I'm not hearing that conversation as much in the built environment, in the building sector. So we have a campaign going called Heritage Now, which is all about elevating these solutions that are place-based and traditionally based from around the world. And I'm hoping that we'll start to embrace more of those solutions in the building sector as a balance to many of the other industrialized solutions that we've already mentioned today.
Yeah, and like we've always said, the most sustainable building is the one you already have, right? At least as a starting point. Yeah, I think as we look ahead, there's one thing that what we'll be doing, maybe I'll say it this way, is really taking some of these outputs and trying to work with some of the multinational development banks. We had a couple bilateral meetings during COP and attended some sessions, and I think they are feeling the pressure and trying to do more. And so they need to know what that means for buildings, including things like requiring risk assessments and things like that that are not being done as a regular basis right now on a regular basis now. So I think there's so much room for improvement, and I feel like finance is really like a key area to try to influence while we can. And then also trying to support the national governments that are signed on to the Buildings Breakthrough and the ICBC and to try to push them towards better codes. I mean, I think I just read that about half of new construction, which is massive, like that's projected, will be in countries with essentially no building energy code. So, I mean, that's something that can change. And so, but we have to be available to ask for that and show them how it's possible and kind of get the private sector in support so that those governments will feel comfortable making those steps. So yeah, those are a couple of the priority things. And I always wish we could bottle up the feeling of COP and like bring it back to people because with all the pains and the would-have, should-haves and stuff, like you are surrounded by people that get it and that are spending their time trying to solve this problem, like majority of people there. And really helps you feel like you are part of this global movement. And so, for those watching, I just do try to catch a couple of sessions and maybe read a few things. And, when you get back to your project and your day to day, say if you, take our recommendations and make this a net zero building and really drop down your embodied carbon, this is in line with these global movements. And this is the report that says that and so on. And, really try to use those different findings and initiatives to push what we all know is possible.
I think one of the things that I was most delighted by, there were a lot of publications that get released at COP, and many of them are demonstrating exactly what Liz said. Here are examples of resilient development, of green cities, green infrastructure, of decarbonized, buildings, whether it's retrofits or new construction. But it's this opportunity for all of these countries and stakeholders to learn from one another and build on a shared knowledge base rather than each country or organization trying to start over from scratch and build all these resources and knowledge in and of themselves. So the relationship building is important, but I think that exchange of ideas and knowledge and the tools and resources that are developed, exchanging hands across the world. And when you walk through the venue and you see all of the different people are dressed in different garb based on where they're coming from, you can, and there's the pavilions representing all of these countries that are there. It really is a UN of it is the UN of climate event, but it is such a really fantastic exchange of culture, ideas, knowledge, information, innovation. And you can participate remotely to many of the sessions, either asynchronously or live. You can listen to many of the negotiations that go on, although some happen in closed door sessions. But it's, really encourage people to participate in the future if they can remotely or if they have an opportunity to go as a delegate, as we did. It's important that folks hear from the private sector that these things are possible, they're achievable, that we're doing this work every day, and we need to do it more often with more stakeholders and scale up.
Well, thank you. We could probably keep talking about all of this for hours and hours, but I appreciated especially ending on a positive note, because I know for those who are in the trenches, as you all are, sometimes it's hard. And also for folks who may be watching, it can feel overwhelming, just the amount of information. So thank you for helping focus some of your insights and giving our readers and viewers some ideas about where to go and what was accomplished. And we look forward to having this group back again, maybe in advance of COP31. And thank you, everyone who joined in. If you do have additional questions, please drop them in the comments. If you don't follow Liz, Laurie, and Anica on LinkedIn, please do. And we look forward to talking to you next time.